Really beautiful abandoned railway viaduct in the distance there. Constant reminder almost of what the landscape used to provide in terms of transport, of course, before Beeching came along and slashed the railways.
Paul.
Oh, okay.
Hey, yes, you're right. This was a Beeching cut. But actually, when it comes to this one, in particular, the story goes so much deeper.
Right.
Shall we go have a look?
Yeah.
Want us to go on running these services at very high cost.
Beeching is a bad word, a household name that will forever stick in the lives of generations. He treated the railways like a business, with no thought for society, communities that would inevitably be adversely affected by his acts. A nation of railways ripped apart at the core, their very existence forgotten with no room to come back, no thought for the future, and now, at a time when we really could use this abandoned infrastructure being brought back to life. At least that's my view and has been for a long time, but perhaps there is indeed a deeper story to tell here. In the mid to late 19th century, railways were being constructed at a dramatic pace. Main lines from London to the north of England had been operational since the 1850s. Passenger and freight traffic was booming and lines were at capacity.
Lots and lots of people had vested interest in the railways, but none more so than Edward Watkin. Edward Watkin was Manchester born and raised. He was an MP and he was on the board of no less than 10 railway companies throughout his career.
Watkin identified that with lines at capacity there was opportunity to build an express line, serving limited areas between London, Manchester and Sheffield.
Most of the main lines that were built from London started with construction in the city and radiated out to the country. The Great Central Main Line was different because it started in Sheffield and Manchester and was built in reverse, headed that way. The lines in Sheffield and Manchester were already pre-existing, so it went through the Woodhead Tunnel from Manchester to Sheffield and then down existing lines almost as far as Nottingham. And then at Annesley, a new railway line was built, which then went through Nottingham, Leicester, Loughborough, Rugby, ending here in Northamptonshire before joining the existing Metropolitan Railway just north of Aylesbury on what became known as the London Extension. The line opened in 1899 to enormous fanfare, although most of it was generated publicity by Edward Watkin. Even though it was the most technically advanced railway in the country at the time, it was never really a runaway success. Initially failed to make any money whatsoever. And even in the heyday of express services through the 1930s, there were only 6 passenger services in each direction a day. The line was mostly used for freight. The industrial areas of South Yorkshire and the East Midlands were ripe with coalfields and factories. Watkin's vision, was to keep everything as straight and as flat as it possibly could to make those services faster, because the route wasn't so direct. Compare it to the Midland Main Line, which was quite a curvy route. Paul, I've got to ask, what the hell are you carrying in your backpack?
Oh, the backpack. This is so cool. Let me show you. So this is the coolest thing ever. This is like an encyclopedia of human invention and discovery. This is today's sponsor. This is the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization. It kind of does what it says on the tin. If I open it up to one of the hundreds of topics and pages of this book, the combustion engine, flip the page, railroad, tells you the entire history, how it was conceived, all kinds of methods from coupling, you name it. This is so in depth about hundreds of different topics.
Oh wow, it's got a page on dirigibles. I love a dirigible.
Dirigible? What's a dirigible?
How do you not know what a dirigible is? Just read the book.
Okay, well that page, like all the others, is beautifully illustrated. It's so much relevance to the channel and the videos I make on this channel. Every page is like this snippet of history of civilization and how we got to where we are today. Compass and navigation, for example. Oh, hello Roman roads. See what I mean about relevance to this channel? So the question is, if you were going to pick this up, well, what page are you heading to from many of the hundreds of different subjects contained within? Personally, I think it's an ideal gift for someone of, well, any age whatsoever, frankly. And if you do pick it up, don't forget to use our discount code in the description below, Whitewick10, and you can get 10% off of your purchase of this book. It's a wonderful thing, I assure you. Let's get back on with today's journey. By the 1960s, the railways in Britain were in decline. The railway mania phase of the Industrial Revolution between the 1850s and the 1900s had led to the construction of hundreds of railway lines, reaching a peak of over 23,000 miles in 1914. These lines almost served every town and village in the country. Because of the way the Acts of Parliament had been granted, sometimes several railway companies would operate in the same area.
In 1923, the numerous railway companies that operated across England were amalgamated into what became known as the Big Four. And this meant that sometimes even small villages could have 2, 3, 4 railway stations that were now being run by the same company. By the time that the railways were nationalised on the 1st of January 1948, the whole sector was pretty much in turmoil. The Second World War had depleted not only all the funding for railways, but also passenger numbers were lower and freight numbers were lower than ever before. Things were looking really, really bleak for the newly formed British Railways.
In addition to this, practices by railway staff could be considered somewhat archaic at best and were also occasionally unsafe. Even the smallest stations required significant manpower to run effectively, as technology in signalling, crossings, ticket bookings had not really changed in decades.
The British Transport Commission started to look at ways to cut costs, and with it, some of the thousands of miles of underused track that were in operation. From its peak at 23,000 miles, over 5,000 miles of track was cut within the 1950s, but it wasn't enough. In order to save the railways of Britain, drastic action was needed. In 1961, the Conservative Minister for Transport, Ernest Marples, announced that there would be a restructure of the British Transport Commission. The railway arm would be renamed as the British Railways Board, and that its chairman would be a gentleman named Dr. Richard Beeching.
The old hands in the industry must have been somewhat surprised by this appointment. Beeching was as far from a railway man as you possibly could be. He was a physicist and had come to the BTC from the chemical company ICI. He wasn't a man known for sentimentality, and maybe this was exactly the kind of person that Marples needed. Marples himself joined the Conservative Party in 1945, achieving MP status in 1951. Now this all sounds very wholesome until we scratch the surface of his other interests. You see, Marples was an 80% shareholder of Marples Ridgeway, an engineering firm with an interest in construction, road building and such like. So he did the honourable thing in 1951 and resigned as managing director, but retained his 80% shareholding. All fine, I guess, but in 1959 he was appointed Minister of Transport. A clear conflict of interest is now present. Marples claimed he was unable to sell the shares. They're worth now between 350 and 400,000, so he simply passed them on to his wife with the right to reacquire them when he left office. Conflict of interest seemingly just vanished.
Throughout the 1960s, road construction projects continued at a heck of a pace, and the jewel in the crown for this was the M1, Britain's first motorway, travelling from Leeds through to London via Sheffield, Nottingham, Leicester, Rugby and Northampton. Marples tasked Beeching with evaluating the state of railways in the country. His report, The Reshaping of Britain's Railways, was released in 1963, and it was honestly an absolutely damning indictment of the railways in this country at the time. Beeching identified that out of the approximately 18,000 miles of operational railway in Britain at the time, roughly 1/3 should be closed. He noted that the least used 50% of stations contributed just 2% of total ticket revenue in the country, and that 1/3 of the route miles covered carried just 1% of railway passengers. But the impact for those 1% of passengers was absolutely devastating. Almost all the lines that were closed were in rural communities, and it took those connections that those communities had. For the agricultural industry, lots of places would have to rethink the entire way they delivered all their goods, taking them from the railways onto land transport, and that would bankrupt the people who ran those businesses. Almost all of the lines that were recommended for closure were branch lines, but there was one huge difference. One of the lines that Beeching recommended for closure was a main line here on the Great Central Railway. So the closure of an entire main line seemed to many people to be absolute devastation and insanity. But in many ways it made sense, because the Great Central Main Line fundamentally copied the exact same route as the Midland Main Line. The stations that had been built for the GCR were often really far from the places that they served. In Beeching's second report, he discussed how containerisation of freight should become much more prevalent because it was much more efficient. And the goods that were being brought along the Great Central Main Line, they weren't really the type of things that could be done in containerised ways, not without huge investments to improve the infrastructure of the railway. Closing the Great Central Main Line meant that bigger investments could be made on the Midland Main Line, and particularly on the West Coast Main Line, which was then given a huge overhaul and an enormous electrification project. The impact of Beeching's recommended closures were, without doubt, far-reaching and devastating for lots of places, lots of communities. But Beeching was a civil servant. He wasn't someone known for sentimentality. He didn't subscribe to the philosophy that the railways needed to stay exactly the same as they had always been. It can be argued that actually it wasn't his responsibility to look at the social aspects that went with the closure of the railways. He was completing a task that was mandated to him. In lots of places, Beeching focused on modernisation rather than closure. He could see where efficiencies could be made. And some of those efficiencies that were put in place led to a completely new way of the railways working. And it can be argued that without Beeching's intervention, the railways in the UK could potentially have ceased to exist, because from the 1960s to the 1990s, and then beyond in privatisation, funding for railways was reduced, and without those drastic cuts, the losses would have continued, and without that, we may have lost our railway service forever. There is little doubt that the reshaping of Britain's railways and Beeching's subsequent reports after that, along with the rebranding of British Railways to become British Rail with its sleek modern design, dragged our nation's railway network kicking and screaming into the second half of the 20th century. However, the impact of these cuts was felt for many years and continues to be felt today. The reopening of some lines shows that mistakes were certainly made.
But what about the Great Central Railway?
Well, part of the Great Central Railway remains operational. The line from Aylesbury through to central London, on what was known as the London Extension, is still operated to this day by Chiltern Railways. And the terminus at Marylebone is without doubt one of London's most aesthetically pleasing railway stations. But the majority of the line, like this section here at Helmdon, remains closed. And whilst other lines are being reopened and regenerated, there are no plans for this one.
If you've enjoyed this tale, you're going to love the story of how London Underground ended up way outside London. Click on that link just up here. And of course, a big thanks to Kate, who's got her own channel in the making. You can click on that link in the doobly-doo below. And of course, a big thanks to the book, this week's sponsor. If you love it and you like the idea of what's inside here, well, you can click on the link in the description below for a 10% off. That is a bargain. And yeah, you're going to love it. See you this time next week.